Imagine waking up tomorrow in a different India. The roads are smooth. Public transport actually works. Factories stretch across the horizon. Young graduates aren't desperately competing for a handful of government jobs because there are opportunities everywhere. The rupee is stronger. Salaries are higher. And leaving the country no longer feels like the only path to a better life. It almost sounds like a fantasy, doesn't it? But countries like South Korea, China, and Singapore weren't always richer than India. In fact, within living memory, many of them were poorer, devastated by war, or struggling to feed their own people. Yet somehow, in just a few decades, they transformed themselves into manufacturing powerhouses and some of the richest economies on earth. So what happened? Was India simply unlucky? Or did we miss something far more fundamental? Something that still affects every job, every salary, and every product we buy today. So hop on as we delve into the story of why India feels like a country with unlimited potential but very limited opportunities. And unless we understand how we got here, we'll never know what it will actually take to become a developed nation. When people think of a rich country, they usually picture things like clean cities, fast trains, expensive cars, and towering skylines. But those are the results, not the reason. The real question is far more simpler. What actually makes a country rich? Economists have observed something fascinating. Almost every country that became wealthy followed a surprisingly similar path. It begins with agriculture. Most people work on farms, producing food. It's enough to survive, but not enough to create widespread prosperity. Farms can only be so productive, and eventually there's a limit to how much income they can generate. The next step is manufacturing. Factories don't just produce goods, they multiply value. A piece of cotton becomes a shirt, iron ore becomes a car, sand becomes a computer chip. Every transformation creates more wealth than the raw material itself. But manufacturing does something even more important. It absorbs millions of workers leaving agriculture, teaches specialized skills, creates supply chains, encourages innovation, and raises productivity across the entire economy. That's why almost every developed country, from Japan to South Korea, from Germany to China, went through a long phase of industrialization before becoming wealthy. Only after a strong manufacturing base is established does the final stage begin. Services, banking, software, finance, healthcare, research. These industries often generate the highest incomes, but they usually stand on top of an economy that already knows how to build things. Think of it like constructing a building. Agriculture is the foundation, manufacturing is the structure, services are the upper floors. Now imagine trying to build the penthouse before the rest of the building exists. And here's where India's story becomes different. While much of East Asia climbed this ladder step by step, India took a very unusual route. We moved from farms almost directly into services. In other words, we tried to build the top floor before finishing the middle. And that one single decision shaped a billion lives, including yours and mine. To understand why that happened, we have to go back to the years immediately after independence. When India became independent in 1947, it wasn't inheriting a thriving economy. It was inheriting the aftermath of nearly 2 centuries of colonial rule. Industries were weak, infrastructure was limited, poverty was widespread. The country had just been partitioned, millions had been displaced, and the government's first priority wasn't becoming rich. It was simply keeping the country together. Then came the big question. How do we transform one of the poorest countries in the world into a developed nation? In 1956, India introduced its second five-year plan, a blueprint that many believed would lay the foundation for a modern economy. The idea was ambitious. Instead of waiting for private businesses to build industries, the government would take the lead. It would invest heavily in steel plants, heavy machinery, power generation, mining, railways, and large public sector enterprises. The thinking wasn't irrational. Private Indian companies were still small. They lacked the capital, the technology, and the scale to build massive industries on their own. Foreign companies were viewed with deep suspicion after colonial rule. So the government concluded that if no one else would industrialize India, the state would have to do it. And to be fair, this strategy wasn't unique to India. Many successful countries had governments play a major role during their early years of industrialization. So on paper, the plan looked promising. But history isn't shaped by good intentions alone. Because while India was busy building industries through government control, another system was quietly taking shape. One that would slowly make it harder to innovate, harder to compete, and harder to grow. It became known as the license Raj. Imagine you have a brilliant idea. You want to build cars. People want to buy them. You have investors ready to put in money. Today, you'd worry about your competitors. Back then, your biggest challenge was convincing the government to let you build them in the first place. This was the era that came to be known as the license Raj. To start a factory, expand production, import better machinery, or sometimes even to decide how much you were allowed to produce. You often needed government approval. The intention wasn't to slow the economy down. The government wanted to control scarce resources, prevent monopolies, and make sure industries develop according to a national plan rather than private interests. But over time, something unexpected happened. Businesses slowly realized that in India, success didn't always depend on building a better product. Sometimes it depended on getting the right license, the right approval, the right connection. Competition, the force that usually pushes companies to innovate, improve quality, and lower prices, became weaker. And when businesses don't face competition, they have very little reason to become world class. Now compare that with countries like China. Their governments certainly intervened in the economy, but they also demanded results. Companies that exported more received support, and those that failed to compete internationally lost that support. In other words, protection wasn't permanent, it had to be earned. India's system gradually became different. Instead of competing in global markets, many businesses ended up competing for permissions. And while all of this was happening, the rest of Asia wasn't standing still. Factories were expanding, exports were exploding, millions of workers were leaving farms and moving into industries. The gap between India and East Asia wasn't created overnight either. Then in 1991, something happened that forced India to rethink about everything. By the early 90s, India had run out of options. The country's foreign exchange reserves had fallen so low that there were barely enough to pay for a few weeks' worth of imports. For the first time since independence, India found itself staring at a full-blown economic crisis. And sometimes, a crisis forces a country to do what years of debate never could. In 1991, India began opening its economy. Many of the old licensing rules were removed. Foreign companies were allowed to invest. Private businesses were given far more freedom to compete. And for the first time in decades, India's economy wasn't being driven almost entirely from government offices. Markets began to play a much bigger role now. The results were dramatic. The telecom revolution connected millions. The IT industry transformed cities like Bengaluru and Hyderabad. Indian companies started competing on the world stage now. For a moment, it felt like India had finally found its path to prosperity. But there was one problem. The industries that exploded after liberalization were mostly services, software, finance, consulting, business outsourcing. These sectors created enormous wealth, but they couldn't absorb tens of thousands of workers leaving agriculture. A software company doesn't hire the same number of people as a car factory. An IT park can't replace an entire manufacturing ecosystem filled with factories, suppliers, logistics, machine builders, and skilled technicians. So India created two very different economies. One India was writing code for the world. The other was still searching for a stable, productive job. And that's why even today, you'll hear two completely different stories about India. One says we're the fastest growing economy in the world. The other asks, if you're growing so fast, why doesn't it feel that way? To answer that, we may have to look beyond GDP and ask a much more important question. What kind of growth actually improves people's lives? At this point, it's tempting to think that the solution is simple: build more factories, offer companies incentives, reduce regulations, and eventually everything will fall into place. But if it were that easy, every developing country would already be rich, because factories don't exist in isolation. Imagine you're a global company looking to build $1 billion factory. Before you invest a single rupee, you start asking questions. Can I trust the legal system if a dispute arises? Will contracts actually be enforced? Can I find workers with the skills I need? Will electricity be reliable? Will goods reach the port on time? Can suppliers deliver? Will government policies suddenly change after I've invested billions? Notice something. Very few of those questions are actually about the factory itself. They're mostly about the ecosystem around it. And that's what separates countries that industrialize successfully from those that struggle. Take South Korea for example. When it began its industrial journey, it didn't just build factories. It invested heavily in education. It trained workers. It improved villages. It built roads, ports, and reliable infrastructure. Most importantly, it created an environment where productivity could keep improving year after year. Factories was simply the visible result. The real investment was in people and in institutions. And this is exactly why India's challenge becomes much bigger than economics. Because building a factory takes a few years, but building trustworthy institutions, an efficient bureaucracy, and a skilled workforce can take generations. That's why becoming a developed nation isn't just about producing more goods. It's about building a society where ordinary people can do extraordinary work. And that's a much harder problem to solve. But it also explains why India's story isn't over yet. Now, the question isn't whether India can become a developed nation. Of course it can. The real question is whether we've learned the lessons that every successful economy had to learn. History has already shown us what doesn't work. Protecting industries forever doesn't make them globally competitive. Skipping manufacturing leaves millions without productive jobs. And economic growth means very little if it only benefits a small section of society. Here the harder question is, have we built the foundation necessary to avoid repeating those mistakes? Because becoming an industrial nation isn't about announcing ambitious targets. It's about solving thousands of existing ordinary problems. Can a business acquire land without spending years in courts? Can contracts be enforced quickly? Can a factory trust that electricity, roads, and ports will work consistently? Can schools and vocational institutes produce workers with the skills modern industries actually need? And can small businesses grow without monopolies eating them on sight? These questions rarely make headlines, but they're the questions that determine whether the next factory gets built or not. History also tells us something very encouraging. No country was born industrialized. China wasn't. Japan wasn't. South Korea wasn't. They became manufacturing powers because over decades, they kept removing obstacles that prevented businesses and workers from becoming more productive. India doesn't need to copy any of them. Our democracy is different, our society is different, our challenges are different. But the principles haven't changed. Productivity, skills, strong institutions, all of these things still matter. Competition matters. And perhaps most importantly, consistency matters. Because factories aren't built for the next election, they're built for the next generation. Whether India becomes a manufacturing powerhouse won't be decided by a single policy or a single government. It will be decided by whether we as a country can keep building the kind of institutions that businesses trust, workers benefit from, and future generations inherit. And that's a challenge that belongs to all of us. If there's one thing history teaches us, it's this. You see, countries don't become developed because they dream big. They become developed because for decades, they solve their smaller problems first and consistently. Maybe that's India's greatest challenge. And maybe its greatest opportunity too. If you enjoyed this video, let me know what you think. What's the single biggest reason you believe India still hasn't become a developed nation? I'd genuinely love to read your perspective in the comments. And if you enjoy videos like these that go beyond the headlines and explore the deeper forces shaping India, consider subscribing. Might want to drop a like as well. Peace out.